Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we are going to begin our new unit, that's Unit 6, discussing industrial and economic development. Oftentimes consider thinking about actually putting this at the very beginning of the year because throughout the year we really talk a lot about levels of development. We talk about less developed countries, we talk about more developed countries, and we talk kind of in hypothetics, and we talk kind of in this mystical world where we kind of talk about what more developed, less developed looks like, what it means. We really don't get down to some of the nitty-gritty of the economic elements of more developed, less developed until we get to this unit. And so, I think a lot of this really brings it together. So it's really important that we pay attention to this because when we talk about more developed countries, less developed countries, this is a lot of what it is that we're referring to. Because when we talk about economic development, and wealth being generated and growing in a country, it allows a lot of those other things to take place. When we talk about development of infrastructure, when we talk about development of education, development of health and health care within a country, and not health insurance, but the health care and the healthcare industry and medicines and doctors and all those types of things, and all that comes with wealth and economic development. And so a lot of this is kind of the foundations of understanding all of that and helping you to get a better and clearer picture of countries as we talk about them as more and less developed. So the very first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what exactly are the different sectors of the economy, because when we discuss economic growth and development, what we're looking at is the economy becoming more diversified, people taking on different types of jobs, people taking on new levels of jobs as the economy grows and as it really changes and morphs, and as new types of economic activity come in a country. And so we're going to go through each of these different economic sectors, and it's really important that you pay close attention to the different economic sectors that I have down here. And there should be a fifth one down here. Quinary is considered to be kind of an offshoot of the quaternary, because when we talk about these, the sectors are going to be really important when it comes to understanding the types of jobs that are available. And typically when we talk about the types of jobs that are available, that tells us kind of the level of development and kind of level of sophistication within a country. So to start off with, when we talk about economics, when we talk about the economy, what we're referring to is anytime we have the production, consumption, and distribution of goods and products within a country. Now notice that we really have three different steps or three different elements to that. We have the production, so you have the creation of the product. But remember, whenever we're talking about economics and we're talking about exchanging goods and services, the reason you produce something, sorry about that, is so that it can then be consumed. And so without the consumption, you really don't have the drive for production. The whole idea of supply and demand, depending on how far you are in your not your economic, but your educational journey, your understanding of all that. And then what's going to be really important, especially in our modern world, and we talk about globalization and things like that, expanding markets, is going to be the distribution of those products, because without distribution, you cannot have increased consumption. And again, if you have increased consumption, a lot of times it's going to drive increased production. So again, economic activity, the production, consumption, and distribution of goods, services, products, those types of things within a country. When we talk about the economy is generally recognized as being divided into four different sectors. So we're talking about four different, categories of jobs, you could consider them. And what we're going to find is that as we move from primary to quaternary, we're going to move from kind of basic, low-level, typically low-paying jobs to more sophisticated forms of jobs as we move down. So this is kind of a continuum. And one of the important things to understand is as we talk about the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary economic sectors, all four of these did not exist at the exact same time, especially as far as the role that they play in the economy. You really start off with most everyone participating in the primary economic sector, and then as time progresses, as the economy advances, as industrialization happens, you then kind of move into the secondary system and more people start participating in that. You have the development and kind of the expansion of the tertiary, and then you have the expansion and the development of the quaternary. Now, if you wanted to get real technical with me, you could probably argue that all of these exist in some way, shape, or form all the time. What we're looking at really is kind of the expansion of, the development of, and the increasing importance of each sector within the economy and kind of the role and part that it plays. And a lot of this is really important to the understanding of capitalism, especially when you talk about kind of the free movement and exchange of goods and services, money, ideas between each of these different sectors. But I think the important thing to understand is that really the secondary grows out of the primary, the tertiary grows out of the secondary, and the quaternary is going to grow out of the tertiary as the economy expands, as people become wealthier, things along those lines. So let me just briefly go over what the different types of economic sectors are, and I'm going to show you how that's related to levels of development. So primary economic activities, this is simply the extraction of raw materials out of the earth. So whether we're talking about different types of mining for minerals, whether we're talking about agricultural production, whether we're talking about harvesting of wood, any of those types of things. So primary economic activities, it's the extraction of raw materials out of the earth. Secondary economic activities, think factory, think factories, think industry. Secondary economic activities deal with the processing of the raw materials into finished products. So the secondary economic activities take the primary economic activities and they make them into a more valuable good. They refine them and they make something typically that's usable for us, whereas we couldn't use it beforehand, or it's just refined and made into a better product, improved product. Now, when we consider this primary economic activities, both of these would be considered blue-collar kind of jobs. The secondary economic activities would be considered jobs that are higher paying, require greater skill, whereas primary economic activities typically require less skill and are much more manual labor. It's much more labor intensive than the secondary economic activities. Tertiary economic activities deal with the moving, selling, and trading of the finished product. So we take the products in the tertiary sector from the factories and then we sell them, we market them, we get them to consumers, things like that. So typically when we talk about tertiary economic activities, these are what are considered service-based industries. And so you see a picture down here. I would imagine that most of your parents are part of the service-based industry. They'd be considered part of the tertiary. I guess maybe everybody except for this construction guy back here, he would be considered part of the secondary economic activities. So anything that's service oriented. We'll move into the quaternary economic activities. This is where it gets a little bit more nebulous in terms of what it is that people are doing, because quaternary economic activities deal more with the exchange of information and high-level intellectual activities. So we're talking about not necessarily teachers, because those would be considered tertiary economic activities, but more along the lines of university professor, people doing research, people collecting data, those types of things. And so, you really have to have an expanding primary, secondary, and tertiary economic activity to be able to pay for people to kind of sit around and think all day. You have to think about what kind of advanced society you have where people actually get paid to, sit around and do research or sit around to think all day. And then we move into the quinary, or quinary, I guess, however it is you pronounce it, economic activities. And these deal with high-level decision-making. Typically the people kind of at the highest levels, the highest echelons of decision-making. So whether we're talking about politicians that are going to impact economic policy, whether we're talking about CEOs that are going to be making decisions for companies, whether we're talking about high-level folks within universities that are going to be making decisions in terms of research and grants and whatever. So you notice a lot of these people within quinary, they're not actually, when we think of work, when we think of labor, they're not doing a whole lot of work and labor, but they're very important people because they're the ones who make kind of the difficult decisions about what direction companies and countries are going to be going in, and that of course is going to impact the economy. It's going to impact the jobs that people have. It's going to impact production. So a lot of those things are very important, even though maybe we don't necessarily think of them a lot of times as work or labor, but they are very important. And if you notice, typically as we move up this scale, typically we're finding higher paying jobs from tertiary to quaternary, quinary, and also typically much more highly specialized. As we move from primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary, we're talking about more highly specialized, talking about higher levels of education, and much greater impact on the economy. So what we're going to look at real quick before we end the video, and I hope I have enough time, is we're going to look at Gapminder. It's been a long time since we've looked at Hans Rosling and his website, so I'm going to show you some correlations between economic activities and levels of development. Excuse me. And so, this is not perfect, but what we're going to look at here on our horizontal axis is income per person, GDP per capita, and this is going to represent development. Again, this is not a perfect representation of development, but it's pretty close. The higher the income per person, typically the better developed the country is going to be. And then our vertical axis is going to be the sector of the economy. It's only going to break it down into 3 parts. It's going to say agriculture, industry, and services, which will correlate to primary, secondary, tertiary economic activities. So notice what we have here. If we look at agriculture as a percentage of the GDP or gross domestic product, we notice that there's this negative correlation between countries that are more dependent on agriculture and level of development. Okay, so the more dependent a country is on agriculture, typically for its income, for its GDP per capita, typically the less developed the country is. So notice this kind of downward trend, but also notice how few countries you have that are really highly dependent on agriculture for large levels of their GDP or large levels of income they have for their people. And so that means that we're really moving towards a much more developed world where the economy is becoming much more diversified, people are getting better educations, able to have better jobs. So let's move on, and this is just for the sake of time. You should come back and play with this and look at it maybe if you have some time. Now, I might encourage you to pause the video, draw a very basic graph as to what you think our graph would look like if we look at industry as a percentage of GDP and see if you get it right. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this. Okay, and this isn't perfect. If we were taking statistics, this probably wouldn't be a good example, but it's a good thing we're not taking statistics. We're taking AP Human Geography. But if you notice, there's this general trend. Notice that the countries that are fairly poor, low levels of income per person, have very low levels of industry. But typically, as we go this way, towards the wealthiest countries, they also have lower levels of industry. Notice what happens when we get into kind of these middling countries, countries that are higher levels of income per person, we have higher levels of industry. So it kind of starts off low, raises up, and then comes back down. And again, this isn't perfect. If we drew a line of best fit for you statistics folks out there, we'd have this kind of nice, almost pyramid shape. Because what happens is as countries develop, a lot of them move into secondary economic activities. People start moving into factories, getting jobs. Think of your migration unit. We talk about people moving from the countryside into cities to look for jobs. So that's where a lot of these countries are. And then as we move forward in development, people get better educations, the economy becomes more diversified, people become wealthier. We move away from that. We move more into the service-based industries. So you see again kind of this nice upward and down. Again, it's not perfect. I understand there are exceptions, and you could probably argue with me about it, but it's my video, so I'm not going to hear you argue. So anyway, what I might encourage you to do now is we're going to do the same thing with the service industries. Again, draw just a very basic sketch of what you think it might look like before I click it. You can pause the video, obviously, and then we'll see what you get and see how you do. Alright, so again, what we see here is that the countries that are wealthier, that are higher levels of development, have larger shares of their GDP as a part of the service-oriented industries. Okay, and look at this. I mean, even some of our poorest countries in the world are moving towards service-oriented economies, which is, typically we consider that really good because the more service-oriented it is, typically the higher paying the jobs are, the better the levels of education, and with that come all the other types of improvements in society that we want to see for the rest of the world. And so you see this nice positive correlation. You have the more developed the country, the more dependent the country is on service-oriented economic activities. So again, not a perfect line, but if we drew a line of best fit, very nice positive correlation. The other important thing for you to note is look at what regions of the world are participating in different levels of economic activity. Which parts of the world are primarily agriculturally based, which ones are primarily industrial based, and which ones are primarily service based. And you'll notice very strong correlations when we talk about less developed, talk about developing, talk about more developed, talk about the economic